Hi, this is Jim. I'm with you again. How you doing today? Let's get right into this. What I'm calling this episode is the decade of the 60s. When 1960 rolled around, I was 10 years old. And looking back, it was one of the most important decades for the United States of America in my lifetime, in my opinion. Of course, my opinion is not really worth any more than anybody else's opinion, but I am amazed going through all this, what all went down in the 60s. So let's just start this. And the first thing of any consequence was September 26, 1960, is the first television presidential debate, Kennedy and Nixon. Kennedy really won the presidency over those debates. He was made for TV and Nixon was not. He was articulate, he was aggressive, he was well studied on the subjects they were going to debate, and it threw him into that November 8th election clearly the front runner. And of course JFK won, but it was the tightest election since 1884. So without the magic of TV, he may not have won. His presidency was short and full of drama and speculation, and for those days, people really talked about his personal life and his beautiful wife and the length of her skirt and all of this stuff. But he had only been in the White House under a year, and in April, the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba began, where we hired guys to go in and try to get Castro. It lasted between April 16th and the 25th, and it was a fiasco. It was a fiasco for the United States of America, for Kennedy, a big black eye. Like, who thought this through? Nobody. And so that's the way it goes sometimes, especially when you're new on the job. Bay of Pigs was a bad deal in a bad situation with Russia and Cuba and the Cold War that seemed to be heating up. And Kennedy kind of got a black eye on that one. Later, in about a month, the minimum wage was hiked, though. Can you all say yay? It went up to $1.25 an hour. I remember working for $1.25 an hour. JFK established the Peace Corps in November of 1961. Do you remember the Peace Corps? It's still around. I wanted to go and work with an organization just like that, or I thought it was just like it, called Vista. A guy had come to our youth group at church and talked about it, and man, I was ready to be recruited in. Of course, by the time I got old enough to do that, I was on to other stuff. August 5th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe died at the age of 36 under questionable circumstances. We all remember that famous little birthday song she sang to JFK. Happy birthday to you, Mr. President. October 22nd, the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Cuba was really a hotbed. Our Navy blockaded the Russians from bringing missiles into Cuba. And this is where JFK, I believe, really redeemed himself, because Russia is the ones that blinked. But if you look at that time, we thought we were going to be engaged in a nuclear war right then. It probably became very close. Came very close. Thank God it didn't happen. Prayer in school was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court on June 17th, 1963. August 28th, 1963, I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. at the Lincoln Memorial. November 22nd, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon Baines Johnson, vice president, became president. Later, Jack Ruby killed Oswald as they were transporting him from jails. Can you remember this? I remember this. I remember them calling us into the gymnasium. We all sat down and they announced that our president had been assassinated. And they let school out. I think for several days we're out. And I remember at home watching TV. It was just nonstop coverage of everything going on with this. And I remember watching it live. Ruby killing Oswald. We were all just sitting around. I remember it. I was in my pajamas. I probably wasn't, but that's how I remember it. Watching TV with my brothers. What a dark, dark time for our country. What a sad state of affairs. We'll never know what kind of President Kennedy would have really been. History's been very kind to him, and I think it should be. Just the Cuban Missile Crisis alone, how he handled that. But he also said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. February 9th and 16th, 1964, the Beatles invaded America and were on the Ed Sullivan Show twice, 2 different Sundays. 70 million people watched. Amazing. July 2nd, 1964. Civil Rights Act. Legislation outlaws discrimination on basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. July 2nd, 1964. September 5th, 1965. Here's one for you. The word hippie was born in an article in the San Francisco Examiner. So some guy, I have no idea, I didn't take the time to look up who it was that coined the word. But that word is still with us today. Ask one of your grandchildren what a hippie is. See what answer you'll get there. November 30th, 1965, LBJ signs the Medicare bill. August 8th, 1966. Beam me up, Scotty. Star Trek debuts. It lasted 3 years. It went where no one had gone before. And even though it only lasted 3 years, we all know about Mr. Spock. 53 years later, we know who Captain Kirk is. Scotty? You say Scotty, and you may get someone saying, beam me up. It's January 15th, 1967. Here's one. The first Super Bowl. The Packers of the National Football League, the old guard, the powerful Green Bay Packers, defeated the Kansas City Chiefs of the American Football League. 40 million people watched. They'd rather watch the Beatles than the Super Bowl. August 30th, 1967. Thurgood Marshall confirmed first black Supreme Court justice. April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee by James Earl Ray. June 6th, 1968. Robert F. Kennedy assassinated in Los Angeles by Sirhan Sirhan. Rosie Greer, George Plimpton, and Rayford Johnson, names of old athletes and Plimpton actually did play a game in the NFL, but he was a writer. They actually tackled Sirhan to the ground and held him for authorities. What a dark, dark time in our nation. I was in Los Angeles, or south of Los Angeles at the time. I was on vacation with my parents, the last vacation right after I graduated from high school. It was like the last vacation you'll ever take with us, kid. When we went to Disney World and went to San Diego and saw where I lived when I was a little kid. I mean Disneyland. Disney World hadn't even been built quite yet. But we went into a barber shop that next morning and found out about Bobby getting killed. And it was really kind of, I almost remember that more than I remember the vacation. August 26, 1968, protests at the Chicago Democratic National Convention. Some of the famous names that came out of that, where there were riots and everything outside of the convention. Jerry Rubin, Tom Hayden, Abby Hoffman. Hayden went on to be a politician. And then November 5th, 1968, good old Richard Nixon won the presidency. He didn't have to run against JFK, I guess. June 20th, 1969, United States of America landed the first man on the moon. This is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Remember Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin? Remember where you were? Did you watch it on TV? I remember watching it on TV. At night, downtown Denver, out on the sidewalk, there were televisions in the windows of the downtown skyscrapers. And I stood there and watched that, thinking, wow, this is way cool. Later that summer, August 15th through 17th, 1969, Max Yasgur had a farm in upstate New York. And we all called it Woodstock. And if you ask someone today about Woodstock, they'll give you one of two answers. Either that bird on peanuts or Yasgur's farm. October 29th, 1969. First email message sent. 50 years ago almost. First email. I don't remember email until 20 years ago, maybe. And on the bright side, because, well, I like email. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like it. But I walk up to the mailbox every day and all I get some junk mail. Unless it's from the IRS, they send it in the mail. But so nobody uses the mail. October 30th, 1969. Sesame Street debuted. Sesame Street. Big Bird. That was a good way to end that decade, wasn't it? Some of the famous speeches, besides Kennedy's "Ask not what your country can do for you" speech, was Martin Luther King's "I have a dream." And the one gorilla in the room all through the 60s was the Vietnam War. Let's never forget. My time's getting away from me. It's been kind of good to look back at that. The world's probably crazier today, but some monumental things happened in the decade of the 60s. Always be kind. If you see someone falling behind, walk beside them. If someone is being ignored, find a way to include them. If someone has been knocked down, lift them up. Always remind people of their worth. Be who you needed when you were going through the hard times. Just one small act of kindness could mean the world to someone.